The Texas afternoon was never gentle. The sun was a red-hot iron plate, burning the air and the thoughts of men. Thaddeus Bear Mallister stood silently by the broken fence, hammer in hand but mind lost. Sweat dripped onto the parched earth, where every grain seemed to cry out with thirst. But Bear was not thinking about the earth, but about something that was lurking inside him, a strange, foreboding feeling of something great coming, something irreversible. It was then that he saw the little girl. A small, slow figure stumbled across the sun-baked ground, her clothes torn, her feet bare and dusty, and her eyes, those eyes, filled with deep despair. Bear froze. She was unmistakably Comanche. There was no mistaking it. And in this place, between Amaria and the endless void, that could mean war. He did not draw his gun. Not because he was naive, but because a voice deep inside him told him that if he fired his gun today, he would no longer be himself. 14 years of working in this conflict-ridden land had taught him that small choices could have far-reaching consequences. And now he was faced with such a choice. He remembered his neighbors, the ones who had no qualms about teaching the Indians a lesson. The ones who believed that if you saw a Comanche on your land, you should shoot first and ask questions later. The ones who lived by the survival of the fittest rule, but had gradually lost the ability to distinguish between living and living right. Bear didn't want to be like them. But he also knew helping a Comanche child, especially now, was challenging the unspoken rules of the land. She spoke no English. But she didn't need to. Her eyes were dry. Her thin hand pointed to her mouth, then gestured toward the stream. Hungry, thirsty, exhausted. The message was simple, clear, and impossible to ignore. No, Bear muttered to himself, as if to push away the strong urge growing in his chest. It's none of my business. But immediately another part of him growled. If a child dies in front of you because you ignore it, then who are you, Bear? He fought not against the fear of the Comanche, but against the fear of becoming a coward, a heartless man like so many who had chosen safety over kindness. A man who had had a son the same age as this girl, a child who had died in agony 3 years earlier from a plague, with Bear helpless. That death had torn a piece of his soul, and now, before him, was an opportunity, a test of fate. Would he turn away silently, or would he dare to step into danger to save what was left of his goodness? He walked toward her slowly, trying to look harmless, not because she was afraid of him, but because he feared he would become something he loathed if he turned away. As he approached, Bear leaned down gently, looking at her with the eyes of someone who had lost everything. She trembled, but did not back away, partly because she was too tired, partly because Bear's eyes were not threatening. Without thinking, he bent down and picked her up. Her body was so light it hurt. A gust of wind blew her torn shirt up, revealing skin wrinkled from dehydration and a small wound that had already clotted with blood. Bear felt her weak breathing, like the last gasp of a dying candle. As he entered the simple cabin, Bear knew that nothing would ever be the same again. He might be killed, the farm might burn down, but if he had to choose between survival by ignoring a child's pain or survival by peril but remaining human, Bear knew he had made the choice. No one forced him to do the right thing, but if he refused the kindness in that moment, he would never be able to look himself in the eye again. And so, Bear refused to be the bad guy, not by reason, but by action. He was asleep in the old chair, wrapped in the only blanket in the house. Outside, the sky was changing, the pale Texas light swallowed by the wild darkness. Bear sat silently in the doorway, watching the thin streaks of dust that rose from the dirt road in the distance. Not the usual wind dust, horse dust. He didn't need to count. He didn't need to look closely. 3 figures on horseback were charging toward his farm with a speed reserved for bad news. Bear's instincts were never wrong, and this time they screamed that there was no time to be afraid. The door opened before Cletus Hartwell had barely come to a stop. The rude, hot-tempered neighbor who always wore his hat low on his forehead was now red as fire and pointing at Bear. "There, what the hell are you doing? Are you crazy?" Behind him was Deputy Morrison, Pete Morrison's son, the one who had told of Chief White Bull's rosary. And finally, Reverend Thomas, the quiet pastor Bear invited to dinner with twice a year. They weren't there out of friendship. They were there out of fear. "Smoke signals," Morrison said, without needing a greeting. "There's a signal fire from the western hills. The Comanches are looking for someone, and my father just sent word. White Bull's daughter went missing 3 days ago." Bear felt a cold sweat run down his back. His heart was pounding, not with fear, but with the truth tightening around him like a noose. He had no time to be afraid. There was no room for hesitation. There were only choices left that would determine his life, the life of the girl, and the life of the land he called home. He could lie. He could deny everything. He could pretend he knew nothing. But Bear understood one thing. If he started this journey with lies, everything he was trying to hold on to would collapse. "She's in the house," he said hoarsely. "Hungry, tired, half dead. I can't leave her." A sudden silence fell over the 3. Reverend Thomas bowed his head as if in prayer. Morrison stood as if petrified. Cletus began pacing like a wounded animal. "Do you know what you've done?" Cletus screamed. "They'll think you've kidnapped her. White Bull burned down the camp over a stray cow. And this, his only daughter. 200 warriors could crush the town." Bear knew. Of course he knew. Every step he had taken since he picked her up had been deliberate. But he had never let fear dictate his actions. And he wouldn't now. Deputy Morrison turned back to his horse, his eyes downcast. "I have to notify the town, but I'll give you some time. If you have any chance to get her back safely, it's now." Bear nodded. No thanks. No lingering. Words were meaningless now as the clock began to count down. When the 3 of them left, Bear re-entered the cottage. The girl was still sleeping. It was painfully quiet, but he knew that outside sleep was being surrounded by an inevitable storm. Bear put on his old leather cloak and tucked his pistol into his belt. Not for fighting, but for survival if things went wrong. He packed bread, dried meat and water into his bag, preparing for a journey no one dared to name. There was no clear plan, no map to the Comanche camp, no guarantee that she would be retrieved, or that he would survive. But there was no other choice, not when the price of silence was a war that would spill blood on both sides. Bear is no hero. He's just a man, alone in a wicked land, trying to do right in a wrong world. And he knows that if he does not act now, his silence will be the greatest confession of his life. There is no time to be afraid. There is only time to act. The clock on the wall ticked steadily in the small cabin, but Bear could hear nothing but the drums. Each beat echoed in the distance like the beating of a demon's heart, heavy, steady, undeniable. He stood, walked to the window and pulled back the curtains just enough to peer out. In the quiet moonlight of the Texas Panhandle, he began to see faint movements. First shadows, then hooves, then distinct figures in battle dress, forming a closing semicircle around his ranch. 200 Comanche warriors, not a scouting party, not a search party. This was a real army, a living message that Bear was at the end of his lifeline. He didn't need anyone to tell him. Every survival instinct in his body was screaming. But instead of running, instead of bolting the door or flipping the table over to barricade himself, Bear just took a deep breath. His heart was pounding in his chest like a knock on fate's door, but his face was as calm as a lake in the early morning. Afraid? Of course he was. Only a fool would not be afraid when he saw 200 arrows flying towards him. But he understood. Fear is no reason to abandon what is right. Only action will separate the living from the buried. Time is up, he said softly, as if to himself. Then Bear turned and bent over the trembling girl. Her eyes widened, looking at him, then out into the moonlight, where the spears glinted like wolf teeth. The girl tried to say something in Comanche, her hands shaking as she counted 10, 20, 30, until she stopped at 200. The number wasn't an estimate. It was a warning, a stark reality. Yeah, Bear muttered. I got the count. He straightened, pulled his leather jacket closer around him, and turned to the girl. Time to go. The girl jerked his hand away, shook her head violently, pointed outside, and put a hand across her throat, an unmistakable sign. If he went out alone, they would kill him. But Bear was determined. In that brief moment, he remembered so many things. The image of his wife and son in the worn-out photograph, the smell of early morning bread baking, the sound of his child's laughter as a child, all the things that made him human, not just a creature trying to survive. He opened the door and stepped out onto the steps. No one said a word. The wind blew cold from the north, carrying the smell of horses, sweat, dust, and unspent blood. Ahead of him, about 50 feet away, sat a man on a steed larger than any Bear had ever seen. Long silver hair, tan skin, and eyes. Eyes like fire smoldering in the hollows of a rock. No introduction was needed. It was Chief White Bull. White man. His voice rang out, heavy as granite from the mountains. We know you took something from us. Send the girl, and perhaps you'll live to see morning. Bear swallowed. His throat was dry as gravel, but he kept walking, arms raised, trying to keep his voice steady over his pounding heart. She came to my water, he said, barefoot, starving, near death. I gave her food, I gave her rest. That's all. White Bull did not blink. You saw the beads, he replied. You knew she was mine, yet you didn't return her. Bear nodded. No denial. She was too weak to ride. I planned to take her back by dawn. The air seemed to freeze. A wave of tension ran through the perimeter. Bear could feel every string tighten, like an orchestra of death waiting for the signal from its commander. Perhaps, White Bull said, then stopped. Or perhaps you were meant to trade her. For safety, for land, for cattle. Bear looked him straight in the eye. No, he replied. I just didn't want the child to die. The little girl ran out of the cabin now, small as a shadow in the moonlight. She spoke quickly in Comanche, pointing to Bear, then to her belly, to her mouth, to the still warm blanket. The warrior's ring began to shake. The tension did not dissipate, but it transformed into listening. Bear stood in the middle of a circle of death, knowing that one wrong breath could kill him, but he did not tremble. He did not scream for help. He was afraid, but he chose to stand there anyway, Because what is right does not need a weapon to defend it, only the courage to hold it. If death came tonight, Bear was ready, not because he wanted to die, but because he had lived right. Bear never thought he would be grateful to a child for interrupting a conversation with a chief who was ready to kill him. But the moment the little girl rushed out of the cabin, grabbed her father's hand, and began to pour her heart out, Bear knew he was no longer in control of the situation. All eyes were on the girl, a tiny figure in the vast plain, her feet bare and dusty, her black hair matted with sweat, but her eyes shining with something Bear couldn't quite name. She spoke quickly in Comanche, pointing at Bear, at the wooden bowl with the remaining broth, at the wooden chair where she'd slept the night before. Bear stood still, silent, partly because he didn't understand what she was saying, and partly because he didn't dare move, as if any movement might send the arrow flying from the waiting bowstring. Chief White Bull listened. No reaction, no interruption. His eyes were still steely, but something had begun to change in them, slightly, but clearly no longer full of anger. Bear still didn't understand until the girl turned to him, pointing to a small photograph on the wooden table. It was a faded black and white photograph in a carved wooden frame. Bear's wife and son, taken before the disease took them. The girl took the frame, handed it to her father, and said something in a quieter voice. White Bull took the frame. His hands were large and rough, but he held the small object as if it were fragile. He studied the faces of the woman and boy in the picture, then looked up at Bear. "You have lost children too," he said, his voice as deep as a falling rock. Bear nodded. "My boy was about her age." White Bull remained silent for a long time, as if listening to a voice that no one could hear but him. Then he turned to the girl and asked her something. She nodded firmly. "She says," he translated slowly, "that she saw the sadness in your eyes when you looked at this picture. That's why she trusted you." Bear felt his heart constrict, not with pain, but with something deeper than empathy. A child without a word of English had seen what no one else in his town had ever seen: loss, and she had chosen to believe him because of it. The atmosphere in the circle changed. Though no one lowered their bows or changed their weapons, Bear could feel it. Disbelief turned to listening, and then listening to astonishment. The girl continued, her voice no longer trembled. Each word seemed carved in stone. The Comanche warriors began to sit up straighter, their faces relaxed, their eyes moving between Bear and the girl. "She is telling them how you carried her," said White Bull. "How you gave her food before asking anything. How you watched her sleep to make sure she was safe." Bear just nodded. He didn't need confirmation. He didn't do it to be believed, much less praised. Then suddenly another voice rose from the crowd. Broken Arrow, the scarred warrior, pointed his spear at Bear and shouted something Bear didn't need to translate to understand: disapproval, anger. He caught only one word clearly: Wasichu, the Comanche word for white man, often used with contempt. The air was as tense as an overdrawn guitar string. But this time, she did not back down. She took a step forward, her eyes blazing. Her voice rose, louder, more forceful. She pointed at Broken Arrow, then at her own chest, then back at Bear. Every gesture, every word, even though Bear didn't understand, conveyed an incredible power from such a small frame. "She's asking him," White Bull said, almost whispering, "what he would want a stranger to do." if his own child was lost and starving in the wild. Bear saw Broken Arrow blink, a moment of silence, a look of confusion. Then slowly he lowered his spear, not letting go, but no longer threatening. The girl turned to the circle of warriors and continued speaking. She pointed at Bear, then at her heart. Her expression was no longer that of a child, but of a woman charged with keeping the truth. White Bull translated, his voice no longer cold. She says, if we punish mercy, we become the monsters the white men believe we are. At that moment, everyone was silent. Bear didn't know when his throat had gone dry. He also didn't know that he was looking at the little girl with the respect that he had only reserved for his family all his life. And then, from the crowd, a clap broke out. Soft, single clap. Then another, and a few more nods. No one gave any orders, but the situation dissolved into understanding. Bear did not understand all of their language, but he understood the miracle that had just happened. A child with no power, no weapons, had done what adults had been unable to do for centuries. When she turned back to look at him, her eyes were no longer those of someone who had begged to be saved. They were the eyes of someone who was protecting him, just as he had done for her. The Comanche camp was deep in a valley between two ranges of red rock hills, more than 15 miles from Bear's ranch, through trails unmarked by settlers' maps. The horsemen left the ranch near midnight, the only light from the moon. Bear sat on the unfamiliar horse, feeling every jolt of the saddle remind him that he was leaving the familiar world, not as a captive, but as a test. Chief White Bull led the way with his daughter beside him. The little girl Bear had lifted from the hay, now sitting upright, her eyes no longer trembling with fear, but glowing with a strange confidence. Bear had no idea what lay ahead. A watchful council of old men? A trial? A moral test? He knew only one thing. If this was his last chance to do the right thing, he would not back down. When they arrived, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten. The fires of the Comanche camp still smoldered, as if reflecting the lingering anxiety in Bear's heart. He was invited to dismount, untethered, unguarded, and led into the center of the camp, where 7 elders sat around a fire. Chief White Bull recounted the incident in Comanche, his hand occasionally gesturing toward Bear, but there was no hostility. His voice was calm, as if he were telling a story rather than making an accusation. Then it was Broken Arrow's turn to speak. His voice was stern but no longer bitter. He emphasized that it was the tribe's tradition to not let anyone touch the bloodline of a chief without paying the price. This, he said, could set a dangerous precedent. Bear stood still, his hands at his sides. He understood. These men were not acting out of personal vendettas, they were acting out of history. An unwritten law that had kept the tribe alive for generations. But then, the little girl stepped forward again. Her voice was clear, sure, unshaken. It was no longer a plea. It was a testimony. She recounted everything, every little detail. The thirst, the bread, the blanket, Bear's sad eyes as he looked at the photo. She didn't embellish, didn't dramatize, just told the truth, in the voice of someone who had almost died and was saved. Not by a warrior, but by someone who knew what loss was. When she finished, the eldest's elder, hair as white as snow, back as curved as an old willow branch, asked her a single question. The girl answered without hesitation. White Bull turned to Bear, translating in English. He asked her if she believed that if another Comanche child knocked on his door on a stormy night, he would be willing to save him, knowing it might cost him everything. And she said, yes. Bear nodded. She's right. The elder did not smile, nor did he nod, but as he rose, the firelight illuminated his face. tracing a symbol older than any law. White Bull translated, he said, "Tonight is a test, not his, ours. A test to see if we still have enough humanity to respond to humanity." Then he added, "You will be returned, not only in safety, but with respect. Your farm will now be neutral ground. Anyone from my tribe who harms you or your land will face this council." Bear stood still. He had not expected reward, nor had he sought honor, but what he received was not forgiveness for his wrongdoing, but recognition that kindness need not be a sacrifice in vain. An elder stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder, a light touch, but more weighty than any compliment. There was no applause, no cheering, just the silence of a shifting mountain. 3 hours later, Bear rode back to his ranch, not escorted, but accompanied by the very men who had tried to kill him. As the sun rose over the Texas plains, Bear stopped his horse in front of his cabin. She hopped off, turned to look at him, and hugged him tightly. For the first time she spoke in English, slowly and clearly. "Thank you for saving me. Now I save you." Bear said nothing. He just placed his hand on my shoulder, as gentle as his own heart at that moment. There was no drumming in his head, no screaming. There was only peace. For the first time in years, Bear felt as if the world had forgiven him, as he had forgiven himself. And that letting go, forgiving, being at peace, is a gift that war can never give. Only the human heart can do that.